What is up, guys? So today I wanted to do something a little bit different where I take all of the main villains in the Arrowverse and put them in tiers. If you don't know what a tier list is, you can look it up. It's very easy to understand. Just follow the video, you will. But iDubbbz very recently, a couple of weeks ago, made a tier list that popularized like a genre on YouTube. So many people have made tier lists, and I thought I should probably do the same with the main villains. Don't worry, I probably will also make a ranking video where I rank all the main villains, but I wanted to do it a little bit different here as well in this tier list. So without further ado, let's take all of the main villains in the Arrowverse, including the new 4 ones, or the 4 new ones, and put them each in a tier. First up, we have the Dark Archer, aka Malcolm. First up, we have Malcolm Merlyn, who was the main villain of Arrow Season 1. This guy was a great main villain, a great first main villain in the Arrowverse. He was menacing. The actor who played him was incredible in the role. His big plan spanned the entirety of the season, which really felt good for the season-long storyline. In the end, he was one of the better villains in the Arrowverse, but I don't think he deserves to be in the S tier, and there are only like a couple villains, I think 3 of them, that do, so I would put him in the A tier and probably near the top of it. Next up, we have Slade Wilson, aka Deathstroke, who is considered to be one of the best villains in the Arrowverse. Deathstroke is a great villain in how menacing he is. His rivalry with Oliver Queen is incredible. His backstory, his motivation, it all works really well for Arrow Season 2, and as such, I would put him in the S tier, although I don't think he is going to go at the top. Ra's al Ghul did not continue the streak that Arrow has had with the incredible main villains they had up until this point. I don't think Ra's al Ghul should have been a main villain of Arrow because he is a Batman villain, but since they are already doing Ra's al Ghul, they might as well do him well, because Ra's al Ghul is one of the best villains in comics, one of the best Batman villains as well, so it's a real shame that he turned out to be a pretty mediocre villain. I don't think he's terrible though, so I would put him in the C tier. The Reverse Flash is considered to be one of the best villains in the Arrowverse at this point, considering he's been the main villain of not only 3 seasons, basically, it's really just 1 season, but he's also been the main villain kind of 2 others. He's also been like a part of a bunch of crossovers and a lot of other episodes as well. He is my favorite villain in the Arrowverse, but I don't think he's ever been the best villain of 1 season. That being said, he's definitely been one of, and he definitely deserves to be in the S tier. Damian Darhk was a weird villain for Arrow because of how powerful he was compared to the Green Arrow. The Green Arrow is just a regular guy who shoots bow and arrows, who is really good at fighting. Damian Darhk has magical powers, and that really did not work for Arrow Season 4. That being said, he was not really the problem with that season. The problem was a lot of other things to do with felicity and drama and things like that, but it didn't help that the main villain was way too powerful for the main hero, making the main hero look really bad in comparison. So I do like Damian Darhk a lot. He's very charismatic, and I really like him on Legends of Tomorrow Season 2 and 3, but I cannot in good conscience put him any higher than the D tier. Zoom, aka Hunter Zolomon, is easily the scariest villain in the Arrowverse. His costume, his voice, the mannerism of it all, it works so well for the menacing aspect of it all. He is probably the most menacing, most scary villain in the Arrowverse, and that works so well for the season. The only reason I don't consider him to be an S tier villain is because when he is unmasked, he's not as good, and he is unmasked quite a lot near the second half of the season or near the end, so because of that, he's not going to be in the S tier, but he definitely deserves to be in the A tier. Non, the first villain of Supergirl, he was terrible. The actor playing him wasn't terrible or anything, but he definitely wasn't good either. The fact that he was really like the second in command to the actual first main villain of the season, Astra, sucked for the character. He was not menacing, he was not a good villain at all, and he definitely deserves to be no higher than the F tier. Just like Non, in the actual same year, Vandal Savage is horrible. In my opinion, Vandal Savage has got to be the most disappointing villain in the Arrowverse because Vandal Savage is one of my favorite villains in DC Comics. Every single time he appears in animation in Justice League, in I think like Justice League Doom, in the movie, as well as Young Justice, every time he appears, he is one of the best villains that does. He's so good in those things as well as in the comics that it's so disappointing that on Legends of Tomorrow Season 1, the actor who played it was bad. His story, everything to do with that was bad. He didn't have a good motivation. He didn't have a good connection to the main character. The fact that the connection to the Hawk sucked. Everything about the character was bad, and that is incredibly disappointing, so he belongs in the F tier. So here we have Adrian Chase, aka Simon Morrison, aka Prometheus. If you followed my channel for any longer than like 10 days, you would know that Prometheus is my favorite villain in the Arrowverse, although that actually has changed recently. I think now Reverse Flash is my favorite villain in the Arrowverse, but Prometheus is certainly the best villain in the Arrowverse for one season, in my opinion. Adrian Chase is such a great villain in his rivalry with Oliver, how menacing he was for the first half and how calculating he was in the second half. It worked so well for the character. I think that the reason he's so high is because of the rivalry with Oliver, which is my favorite rivalry in the Arrowverse, or at least for one season. And as such, he definitely, in my opinion, deserves to be in the S tier, and probably going to be at the top of the S tier, which I will rearrange the tiers at the end. Savitar, I do think, has actually gotten better over time for me. The suit, it looks really cool. The mystery of who he is in the season worked until it was revealed, where it was very predictable and came way too late into the season. Other than that, though, I think he was actually a pretty good villain, at least compared to newer villains. Just I used to not like him very much. If this was the Flash season 3, he probably would have been in the C or D tier. But looking at him now, honestly, he's a lot better than I remember, comparing him to newer villains like the 3 out of the 4 villains this year. So I would put Savitar in the B tier, as he's a lot better than he probably originally was in the Flash season 3. Supergirl, it didn't really get villains until season 3. Raya didn't appear until episode 15 and had basically no connection to the season other than the love interest who debuted in this season. Raya is not a good villain. She's not menacing because we already knew she's like way less powerful than the main character because Daxamites are not as powerful as Kryptonians. Raya is just not a good villain. The actress who played her is not good. I think that she definitely deserves to be in the F tier. The Legion of Doom were a lot of fun. Reverse Flash is kind of the actual main villain of the season, but I think the entirety of the team is also kind of the main villains. I love the back and forth between these characters, especially Damian Darhk and Malcolm Merlyn. I love that these are all characters who were originally villains on Arrow and the Flash, as well as Captain Cold, who was also kind of a villain on the Flash, but not a main villain. I really like how this all went. I like their storyline. I like the rivalry between the Reverse Flash and the Legends of Tomorrow, or the Legends. Everything about the Legion of Doom was a lot of fun. They're not incredible, they're not S tier material, but I definitely think that they belong in the A tier. Ricardo Diaz is one of the most disappointing villains in the Arrowverse. I expected him to be so badass because in the comics, Ricardo Diaz or Richard Dragon, one of the two, is one of the best, if not the best, fighters in the entire universe, which I expected to see that on screen, but they didn't do that. He wasn't a great fighter. He was like a worse fighter than the Green Arrow, which was very, very disappointing to see. Not only that, but I really don't like the actor who plays him, and he didn't become the main villain until a little bit too late into the season, or at least before that they had such a bad villain that it felt like way too late into the season. The rivalry between him and Oliver didn't really become great until episode 7 of season 7, so he's pretty bad because that doesn't really equate into this, which he's the main villain of season 6, not 7. Oh, I think I'm going to put him in the D tier. I think that the Thinker could easily have been in the A tier if it hadn't been for all of the body swaps. All the other actors who played him didn't really embody what Neil Sandilands was going for. They didn't really act like DeVoe at all, which is why I don't think the Thinker ended up being an incredible villain. That being said, when Neil Sandilands was the Thinker, he was great. He was such a good actor, and he had such a good rivalry with Barry Allen that I think that this season, the Flash season 5, could have been a lot better if they just hadn't done all the body swaps that really ruined a large portion of not only the season, but the villain as well. That being said, he still is pretty good, and I would put him in the B tier. Reign is the first time that Supergirl did a main villain well. They planned her to be the main villain from the very beginning, which really worked for the character. She was very menacing. I think her rivalry with Supergirl was not incredible, but definitely pretty good. The only reason she's not going to be higher than B tier is because she definitely kind of fell by the wayside near the end of the season. She felt like she was an afterthought going into like episode 18 to the ending or something like that, because the creator, Selena, or I think it was Serena or something, one of those two, she appeared as well, where she didn't overshadow Reign, but she felt like she turned out to be the main villain, which I really didn't like that they did that. But because of that, and also the World Killer sucked, I'm not going to put her in the A tier, but I will put her in the B tier. Malice is very different from the rest of the villains because he only really appeared in one episode, or at least one episode plus another scene in another episode. The rest of the episodes, he was possessing someone, he was basically talking through other people, and because of that, I don't think he really got a good rivalry with any of the legends. That being said, I love the CGI for him. I do really like how he was built up throughout the season, and I think he does belong in the B tier. So now we get to the new villains of the Arrowverse, starting with Emiko Queen. Emiko Queen, in my opinion, is not a very good villain. She's not a physical threat at all. The actress who plays her is not good, and the writing is kind of terrible. Her rivalry with Oliver is not great, in spite of the fact that they have a great backstory together that really could have worked. It just didn't. Really, the only thing I like about the character is her costume, but that's just not enough to take her out of the D tier, and she's probably the worst villain on Arrow. Cicada in The Flash Season 5 was kind of a breath of fresh air because the first one was such a pushover for Team Arrow. This new one debuted and she was kind of badass. She was way more threatening and menacing, and she definitely had a great debut. That being said, over the course of the next couple episodes, she did also kind of get a little bit boring, just like her predecessor, the first Cicada. Not nearly as boring, but still not a great villain by any stretch of the word. Still though, she was pretty badass, so I would put her at the bottom of the C tier. Lex Luthor is maybe the most surprising villain in the Arrowverse and how good he was. Not because I don't think Lex Luthor can be a good villain, because obviously he can. He's one of the most famous villains of all time. But I do think it's because Supergirl Season 4 before he debuted was not going very well at all. And honestly was my least favorite season of Supergirl until he debuted, and he turned it into probably my favorite. He single-handedly took this season and this show out of the dirt and made it kind of good in the last couple episodes of Season 4. Lex Luthor, although he didn't appear much, was easily the best villain that Supergirl has ever seen. I think Jon Cryer honestly is my favorite live-action portrayal of Lex Luthor ever, despite the fact that his beard looks a little weird on the character. He's never had a beard. Other than that, he's perfect. Everything about him is great. I love the calculating villain. I like how he connects to the rest of the season and how he's basically behind everything. I think that he is a great villain. His rivalry with Supergirl is amazing, and honestly, even though he didn't appear, he had a better rivalry with Superman in this season because of how much he clearly hates him. I think they nailed everything about Lex Luthor, and although he didn't appear much, he definitely belongs in the A tier, and I think he would have been in the S tier if he just appeared a lot more. Finally, finishing off pretty weak is Neuron, who I don't think is a very good villain, mainly because he's kind of a carbon copy of Malice, and not in a good way. He's Malice, but a lot less interesting. The only more interesting thing about him is the fact that he has a connection and rivalry with Constantine, but I don't think that's enough to keep him out of being a pretty bad villain that belongs in the D tier. So that is my tier list for all the Arrowverse main villains. This is not exactly in order, as although each character and villain are in or is in their specific tier, the tiers are not in order. Like, for instance, Prometheus is not the third in the S tier, and Zoom is not the second. They are both the first in their specific tiers, but I will not put this in order because I don't feel like it, and there's no real reason to, and also I'm going to go over my actual list in a different video. So let me know your tier list in the comments down below, and what do you think of mine. If you like this video and you might want to see more tier lists, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for watching.